Okay, let's kick it off. Hello and welcome to our Conservation Conversation webinar series. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. I am Marissa Olszewski. I'm the Environment and Community Program Manager here at Maryland LCV Education Fund. And building on our popular weekly Friday Digest series that we host during the Maryland legislative session, Conservation Conversations is our monthly Lunch and Learn series during the non-legislative months, where we discuss environmental and conservation issues in Maryland. These conversations are designed to give you context and information about environmental policies and their impact on the state and your community. We keep these brief, however, only 30 minutes each, so they will provide a good introduction, not a deep dive. And you can catch up on previous episodes of these conservation conversations on our YouTube channel. Joining me today is Kristin Reilly, a friend and colleague. Kristin is Executive Director of the Choose Clean Water Coalition. This is a broad coalition of more than 320 nonprofit organizations from across the entire 64,000 square foot Chesapeake Bay watershed. The coalition collectively advocates for clean water in rivers and streams across the watershed and for the restoration and health of the Chesapeake Bay itself. Recently, among its advocacy activities, the coalition has been focused on pushing the federal-state partnership organized under the Chesapeake Bay Agreement for strong revisions to the agreement's goals and priorities for bay restoration. And this is what we've invited Kristin here to discuss with us today. From our conversation today, we're hoping you all leave with 3 takeaways. First, what is the Chesapeake Bay Agreement and why is it important? Secondly, how did we find ourselves in this moment of revision, and what are the politics that drive the conversation and outcomes of the agreement? And finally, how can you respond and be a part of positive change for the Chesapeake and your local waterways? So Kristin, welcome. I'm hoping you can start us off with some additional background about the Chesapeake Bay Partnership and the Bay Agreement to get us started.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thanks for that great introduction, Marissa. And I have a few slides. I think
Excellent.
I'll be pulled up here in a second. Can walk us through a little bit. Wonderful. And it's great to see all these folks from Montgomery County. That's where I grew up. So shout out to everyone in Montgomery County here today. But yeah, so I will talk a little bit about just 2 things on background here, the Chesapeake Bay program, and then the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. So if we go to the next slide. Just a little history for folks. So the EPA Chesapeake Bay program, so this is something that is now, I guess, it had celebrated 40 years last year. It's going to its 41st year. It is a partnership, very much a state and federal partnership. It is made up of the Bay states. So you see Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, West Virginia, New York, DC, all represented within the Bay program. In addition to that, the Chesapeake Bay Commission, which represents Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania at the state level within their state houses as another part of that leadership. And then the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, that represents the entire federal family. So these are sort of the main leadership of the Bay program. We call them the signatories, and they are the ones that sign the agreements. They are the ones that make that commitment. So when we say these, states, Maryland, Virginia, we talk about EPA, there's a whole lot more that goes on beneath that surface. So when we talk about Maryland, it's, all the state agencies that are working on environmental protection and restoration here. So we've got, Maryland DNR, we have MDE, we have planning, Department of Ag. It is a big partnership among a variety of agencies, and that's replicated throughout the other jurisdictions, the other states in the watershed that are represented there within the Bay program, as well as other federal agencies. So while EPA is the only signatory, all of the other federal agencies that represented, including U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, NOAA, the Forest Service, USDA, Army Corps of Engineers. It's a very broad partnership, and that is really because this is a very broad, the work is very broad, right? We want to talk about more than just water quality, right? There's a lot that goes into the restoration effort as far as habitat, fish and wildlife, and creating new access points for people and things like that. So we want to make sure that all the different agencies at the state and federal level are working together collaboratively towards all of those different goals and targets that are outlined in these agreements. So it can get a little crowded within the Bay program. It's a lot of people, it's a lot of opinions, it's a lot of perspectives, but in a lot of ways, it's really great. It's bringing in a lot of different experts, scientists, knowledge, and experience, and it's a really key part, I think, of what makes the Bay program unique and actually successful is having all of those different partners at the table. So you can go to the next slide. So the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. So this is a picture of the first agreement being signed in 1983. So this first agreement sort of, didn't have a ton of details, but it just an initial agreement bringing all the different jurisdictions together and committing to restoring the Chesapeake Bay. The 1987 version of the agreement actually brought in some numeric targets, so got a little bit more specific, a little bit more of a commitment on different things. And then we see fast forward to Chesapeake 2000. So there were in between there were various agreements and things going on and commitments made, but the next really big one was in 2000, and that was when certain jurisdictions like New York, Delaware, and West Virginia actually signed on for the very first time. So that was the first time we're seeing all of the Bay jurisdictions really committing to the restoration effort. But over the course of its history, it has been, a very inclusive partnership. So you can go back to the next slide. And so the current agreement that we're operating under for the next month or so is what we call the 2014 Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. So there are a few things that happened right before this agreement that I think are important for folks to know as far as context goes. So 2009, 2010, there were two major things that happened here for the restoration effort. The first being President Obama was elected, and one of the first things he did was issue an executive order on the Chesapeake Bay, calling it a national treasure, and basically directing the federal family to accelerate their progress, to coordinate better, and to really start to make some headway on the restoration effort. So that catalyzed a lot of movement that got people really energized, and they started working on what the next iteration of this agreement and what the next iteration of the restoration effort would look like. At the same time, there was also a settlement that is pretty famous, I guess, around here in the Chesapeake, a suit settlement that basically created the TMDL. So that's the total maximum daily load for the Bay. And when we talk about the TMDL, we're talking about nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment specifically. And what the TMDL did was set a numeric amount of nitrogen, an amount of phosphorus, and amount of sediment that could enter the Bay and have it remain healthy. So that total maximum daily load of that pollutant is what is allowed to come in. And so both of those things happening around that time frame really brought a lot of energy and kind of breathed some life, I think, back into this restoration effort in a way that really helped push things forward. The coalition was also created in 2009, not by coincidence as well. But with all these things happening around that time frame, people really felt like it was something that was needed to have a coalition like us that was able to sort of coordinate and advocate for the resources that were needed now with all this new attention, but also hold folks accountable to progress based on the renewed interest. So the 2014 agreement, it had 5 major themes. It had 10 goals and 31 outcomes. It was very broad. Everything, again, from blue crabs and oysters to public access and environmental education, and everything in between. And then again, also included the TMDL. So again, the TMDL was created in 2009. So this is the first time we're seeing the TMDL show up in an agreement and sort of creating benchmarks and check-in points that were going to be required as part of this process. So 2014 agreement had I wouldn't call it an end date, but it had a date by which all projects needed to be in place. So all of the projects we were planning to do needed to be in the ground by 2025 in order for us to be successful. I think it was 18 out of the 31 outcomes we were successful in this previous agreement, but we did miss the mark on a number of them. And that has been part of this conversation of the revisions of this agreement. So if you go to the next slide, talk a little bit about, so this is part of the current 2014 agreement that's going away. So these were those 10 outcomes here. So you can just see how broad some of this was. And something that I think people really appreciate is having an agreement that does incorporate a lot of different things and isn't just focused on, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment reduction, but the things that actually help reduce those pollutants, right? Like land conservation and habitat. So we can go to the next slide. So the revised agreement. So this is what we've been working on for several years, but really in earnest starting in January of this year is when the drafting of the revised agreement started. They really wanted to take a look at those goals and outcomes and see where things could be streamlined. They wanted, there were conversations about needing to focus more solely on water quality versus keeping it very broad. In the end, it still remains as a broad agreement, has most of the things and topics that we talked about, a couple of new ones in there as well, but it's focusing on 4 goals and 21 outcomes. And like this current agreement was 2025, this revised agreement will be looked at again in 2040 to measure our progress and see where we're at. Next slide. So here's what we're looking at when we talk about those revised outcomes. So again, there's these 4 sort of pillars here. Those are the 4 goals. So we have thriving habitat and wildlife, clean water, healthy landscapes, and engaged communities. So they combined a couple of things to get down from those 10 original goals and into these 4. And you can see underneath each of those bullets are those outcomes that are associated with those new goals. So you see under thriving habitat, you'll see oysters and stream health, wetlands, clean water. We have toxic mitigation, the reducing excess nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment is TMDL. Healthy landscapes, a lot on protected lands and trees, and then engaged communities. You'll see things like the student environmental education and public access and things like that. So that's the quick version of the overview. I figured we would get into more of the nitty-gritty during the Q&A part, but that's just a little background of where we've been and where we are now.
Great, thank you for that. And I do have questions to expand on some of the things that you brought up there. So thank you for giving us that history and overview of the Bay Partnership. I wanted people joining us who maybe have not been tuned into this to feel like they had a background of what we're talking about. The revisions, you talked about the structure of the partnership and that the revisions got started this year. Can you talk a little bit about the approach that guided the revisions and how much of that was guided by science, or how much of it is just states and personalities and politics?
It's a great question. So as I think everyone is aware, starting in January, it was a very interesting time, to say the least, in this country, especially for folks working in the environmental movement, but also folks at the federal level, working in the federal government. And so it was always going to be an expedited process. Trying to revise this agreement, in 12 months was going to require a lot of manpower and people focused on this issue. And I think in a lot of ways, there was a push to really try to focus on science and to make sure that we were moving things forward in a way that was continuing to build on the progress that we have seen. Unfortunately, I think in a lot of ways, this agreement misses that mark. I think for a variety of reasons. I certainly do think that there's a level of wanting to make sure that we are creating targets that are achievable. Again, we hit 18 out of 31 outcomes in the last agreement. And I think there seemed to be a lot of conversation among the folks in the Bay program that they wanted to try to make sure that they were setting targets that they could achieve. I'm a big proponent of setting a target for what it needs to be, not in order to claim success. But I do think that did play a role in it. I also think it can't be underestimated how much of the current political climate did impact this work. I think it is a challenge for folks to feel motivated or inspired to reach for more, to think creatively, and out of the box, right? And be inspirational when they're not sure if their key card is going to get them into their building in the morning. When their grant program has been unilaterally terminated by the Office of Management and Budget. And so I don't think we live in inspiring times, and it isn't really to give people a pass either. But it's hard to feel inspired when you're not really living in inspiring times. And so I think that's I think every Bay Agreement has been a snapshot in the moment in time in which it was written. And I think 15 years from now, we'll look back and say, this makes sense for the time that it was written in.
There's always historical context, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that is sort of the negative side of our feelings on this. But the Choose Clean Water Coalition submitted a really thoughtful comment letter. We were glad to sign on to that about the draft document and these revisions. We don't have time today to cover all of that letter and all of those suggestions or what's come out of it, but I thought we could talk about some of the revisions that maybe the coalition was happy to see, some of the things that were that are moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there are some really good, pieces here in the agreement. We were very excited to see a renewed commitment and emphasis on land conservation. I think land use and protected lands are one of the, bigger challenges for water, right? Everything that happens on land impacts water. And often we're thinking about these things in two different silos, two different camps almost of the environmental movement when they're so intricately connected. So I think that was really something that we liked to see, that really being elevated restoration and conservation sort of together, and wanting to emphasize that, conservation kind of helps prevent the need for the restoration piece, right? If we're conserving it, you need less restoration on the back end. So we're happy to see that. We're really grateful to see some new things added in, including a target relating to freshwater mussels. So that's looking at non-tidal, more rivers and stream health. That's where most people, are living in the watershed. They're not living on the banks of the Chesapeake Bay. They're living throughout this entire watershed. And even, out in Montgomery County, right? We're not always thinking about the Chesapeake Bay. We're thinking about the Muddy Branch. We're thinking about Potomac, and other local rivers out there. So we were excited to see some of those things, other indicator species of health, like water birds, as an indicator species of wetland health. Those were some really great little tidbits that we saw in there, and we're really hoping that we continue to sort of look that direction, right? How are living resources, how are fish and wildlife and habitat responding to the work that we're doing, right? We're installing these BMPs, we're doing these tree plantings, we're doing all this really great work. What is nature saying, right? How are they responding? And I really feel like that's where we want to see this restoration effort sort of go as an indicator of how well we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And same on conservation. Great to see that was brought up to a pillar, and hopefully we'll see that play out over this. And speaking of how it all plays out, there was a lot of talk around how the total maximum daily load, and you mentioned it in your background about how that plays in. That's actually legally binding by the Clean Water Act, unlike this agreement, which we've said is voluntary. So what's the interaction between the two, the relationship between the two, and how do we see that moving forward?
Yeah, so it's a great question and a very good distinction for folks to know is that if the Bay Agreement ceased to exist, if there was never another one, the TMDL is still there, right? That is something that, as Marissa just said, is part of the Clean Water Act. It actually has teeth. It's regulatory in nature. It has that thing that people have that can and have sued under. With this agreement, this is a voluntary agreement. So everything they're committing to on public access, on wetlands, all of those targets, those are all something that the states are voluntarily signing up for and saying, we're going to do this amount, right? And so when it comes to what we're advocating for all of it, when we're providing as Choose Clean Water and as advocates for making sure that they're advancing on all of those different things. But the TMDL still remains a very important tool in this toolbox. And the way I like to look at it is the Bay Agreement really is the implementation plan for how we're going to achieve that TMDL, right? If we restore this many number of acres of wetlands, if we reconnect this many miles of stream and fish passage, if we're planting this many number of trees or conserving this amount of land, we are going to reduce this much nitrogen, this much phosphorus, this much sediment, and it's going to get us to where we need to be. So that's how they're, sort of connected, and they work, together. But in the end, regardless of what's in this agreement relating to the TMDL, nothing has changed about that original language that was put together in 2009 and 2010. So that remains, as is.
Right. I want to pivot briefly and talk about the signatories, because one of the other things that the coalition has commented on is that earlier, I think it was last year, actually, I should have gotten the time right. The Indigenous Conservation Council submitted a request to be included as a signatory of the partnership, the Chesapeake Bay Partnership. What's happened with that request?
Yeah, so the Indigenous Conservation Council is a nonprofit that represents the 7 federally recognized tribes in the Chesapeake Bay. All 7 of those tribes are actually in Virginia. And right now there is very little engagement, I would say up until this year, very little engagement or representation within the Bay program from tribes and Indigenous people in general. And so they issued a letter to the Bay program in January asking that they be involved and actually sit on the executive council as a signatory of the Bay Agreement, and then have more representation throughout. And so that throughout the course of this past year, during the revisions to the agreement and everything, those conversations have been happening. What it looks like is going to happen in December, the agreement is going before the executive council, those signatories, the governors of the Bay states, and mayor of DC and EPA, and they are going to affirm that revised agreement. They are also going to look at a proposed directive that they will give back down to the Bay program that says, I think it's July of next year, I believe. They have until July of next year to work with the tribes to figure out what that relationship looks like, what the representation looks like. There's no commitment in there about what, if they're going to be on the executive council, if they are going to be a signatory or not, but basically that they have until July to sort of discuss and figure that out. So we are we endorsed ICC's petition on that, and are very supportive of more tribal engagement and representation and leadership within the program. And so we will be tracking that to make sure that those conversations are happening and they are being inclusive and done in partnership with ICC.
Great. So more to come on that.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've had a few questions come in that I want to get to before my last question. So I'm going to switch over to some audience questions here. One person asked, what is the biggest challenge in implementing this Bay Agreement, or what will be the biggest challenge as you see it? And what, sorry, I had a question and a word wrong here, but what was the biggest success that we see from the last agreement, and what do we think is the biggest challenge of implementing this one?
So I'll flip those because I think it'll feed into the second one. But I think the biggest success of the last agreement is there were a lot of really great things that happened and successes that we had that I don't think got really emphasized maybe enough. But especially things that really impact people. We did really great work on ensuring public access sites were increased throughout the Chesapeake Bay. I believe over 300 public access sites were created in the last 10 years here in the Chesapeake Bay region. And then the other one that we were really excited about was the protected land. So they, in the last 10 years, have protected 2 million acres of land here in the Chesapeake. I think the challenge on implementing the Bay Agreement piece, I think, to reflect on that as an example, what we were hoping for was to see, okay, we got 300 new sites that blew the target out of the water. So the 2 million acres of protected lands, let's build on that, right? What is the trajectory looking like, and how can we continue to build on that? And we're not seeing that in the revised agreement. So for the next 15 years, they have a target of 100 new public access sites, while expanding the definition of public access. It's now including green space, especially in urban areas, which it didn't before, but they're lowering the target. We can see the same thing happening with protected land. So they just did 2 million in 10 years. They're going to do 2 million in 15 years. So, I think, I don't think we're going to have any problem probably achieving and implementing what's in the agreement, because I know my members are going to work really hard, just like they always do, regardless of the numbers in here. And we're going to, probably hit these targets sooner than we had anticipated. So I think the challenge, ends up coming from the resources and the need, right? I think there was a question I saw about impacts from federal funding on the Bay program. And they certainly have not been immune to that. A lot of federal funding has been frozen, unfrozen, is currently frozen. Right now we have a lot of money for agricultural projects that are frozen. Folks cannot work on projects right now because they will not be reimbursed if they do. So it's been challenging, and it has slowed down progress. Projects are not getting in the ground during prime planting season. And so that is going to be a really big challenge if we continue to have this fluctuation in what funds are available that we used to have. The uncertainty is going to delay our ability to do this work.
Yeah. Hopefully not for too long.
Not if we have anything to do with it.
One brief specific question. People are asking about the plastic pollution piece. Is that included under the toxics? Is toxic specific, or how are those outcomes being looked at?
Yeah, so toxics is broad, and specifically calling out PFAS, microplastics, I believe were also in there. We had advocated for the addition of pesticides as one of the ones called out. That was not something that they took up, unfortunately, but it is broad enough. And honestly, in some ways, the toxics target is too broad. It doesn't really talk about a lot of what they're going to do other than share information among the jurisdictions. So it's not overly exciting anyway, quite frankly. But there are components to it that do reflect concerns around plastics and microplastics.
Okay. And one other thing I wanted to touch on, they altered the way that climate change is being addressed in this agreement. So can you just offer for us over how is that being looked at?
Yeah, so with the changing administration and the priorities of the current administration, there are certain things that needed to be revisited in this agreement, and that included climate change. So as you may have seen in the earlier slides, that climate adaptation was a part of an outcome in the last agreement. It is not in this one. What they have changed it to, I believe that it is under the water quality ones, but it is adapting to changing environmental conditions. And so one of the, I think, key roles that that is going to play is in the entire agreement is trying to figure out how climate is impacting all of the different other components. I think that was always sort of the intent, was really wanting to incorporate climate impact into all of the different targets, and how it's, impacting the blue crab population, how it's affecting public access sites. We're creating 300 public access sites, and now how many are going to be underwater in 20 years, right? So to be honest, like I think that there was a challenge with that outcome in the past agreement. And so it remains to be seen, I think, how it'll be incorporated moving forward. But it is something that is still being incorporated into the model, right? These changing environmental conditions are adjusting the way that the loading and everything else that we're seeing for the TMDL. But it along with other things are certainly not as explicit as they used to be.
Okay. One last question, because we've got a minute left here, and I do want to wrap up. We've talked about this commitment, political dynamics, sort of the challenges to progress, but I see you with a lot of optimism leading our coalition. And I just want to ask, why are you still hopeful? What can we talk to our audience today about how they can participate in your hopeful vision for this?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that, working in this movement certainly, but just someone who's passionate about these issues, I think it's important to try to hold on to some of the positivity, because it'd be easy to burn out or to just simply say, this is too much. I don't know what to do. There's nothing I can do. I'm only one person. And we've seen a lot of little successes throughout the year that have really sort of reminded me that no, like one person really can make a difference. And certainly more than one person can. And so, with our 300 coalition members across the entire watershed, I know, we are speaking with one loud voice and changing and pushing back in the ways that we can. But that's really where I find my inspiration is the fact that regardless of what is happening, the challenges we have with federal funding going and coming and the targets or whatever it might be in the Bay Agreement, that the coalition members are all nonprofits that are working in local communities across Maryland, across the entire watershed, and they're going to go out and they're going to do what is necessary to improve your local community, right? They're going to look at your stream and say, this is what we need. They're going to look at your green space and say, this is, this community is asking for this, right? We need to help them with this. And they're going to do really great work across the watershed that's all going to feed in and continue to move forward. None of that is going to end and stop because they're too motivated, right? They're too passionate about this. And so that's where I find my inspiration in these folks that are really doing this good work in their local communities. And for folks that are looking for that inspiration, who are trying to find those glimmers of hope and silver linings, I would recommend looking for those groups. Find those groups in your neighborhood. You probably know those people. They may be on the PTA with you at your kid's school. But try and volunteer, do what you can, give, if you're able. But folks, I know our coalition members that, they're always looking for folks to help out, and it can be a really inspiring thing for you as well, and really kind of renew your faith in humanity in a lot of ways, when you're giving your time or capacity or anything else. And so that's just what I would recommend, is to try to find that inspiration in the people that are doing the good work on the ground. Absolutely.
We all have a role to play. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry we have run out of time, gone over just by a minute. This is our last conservation conversation of the year. So we're asking, please, that you fill out our survey. It's in the chat. We hope to improve upon this program for next year. And please make sure you're on our email list to get our updates. And thank you for joining our Conservation Conversation series. This is exactly the kind of informed dialogue we need to build a cleaner and more equitable Maryland. Hope everybody has a great rest of your day.